Jacob Thornton had long since stopped expecting anything from his daily rides across his property, except confirmation that the drought was killing his cattle and that his water sources were drying up faster than he could manage. At 42, he felt decades older, worn down by 5 years of solitary existence, since fever had taken his wife Margaret and their 8-year-old daughter Emma within days of each other. The ranch that had once been filled with laughter and purpose had become merely a place where he performed routines that kept him alive without giving him any particular reason to be grateful for that survival. He was checking the river, now more accurately described as a creek, or even just a series of disconnected pools, when he heard the sound. At first he thought it might be an animal in distress, but as he guided his horse closer to the sound's source, he realized it was unmistakably human crying. Not the brief tears of minor injury or frustration, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone experiencing profound grief. Jacob's first instinct was to turn away. Other people's troubles were not his concern, and he had learned through bitter experience that involvement usually brought complications. He was better off avoiding, but something about the quality of that crying pulled at him despite his determination to remain uninvolved. It reminded him of sounds he had made in the weeks after burying Margaret and Emma, the kind of grief that came from losses so devastating that the very act of breathing felt like betrayal of those who could no longer breathe. Against his better judgment, Jacob dismounted and walked toward the sound, and found her sitting on a flat rock beside one of the few remaining pools of water, an Apache girl who looked to be about 12 years old, wearing traditional dress that was torn and stained, her long black hair tangled. Her small body shaking with sobs she seemed unable to control. Jacob stood uncertain, torn between the impulse to leave immediately before getting involved in whatever tragedy had befallen this child, and a competing impulse he couldn't quite name that kept him rooted in place. The girl sensed his presence and looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her face showing no fear of him despite every reason to be wary of a white man appearing suddenly while she was alone and vulnerable. Instead, she simply stared at him with an expression of such complete desolation that Jacob felt something crack in the armor of indifference he had been carefully maintaining for 5 years. He spoke awkwardly, his voice rough from disuse. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The questions felt inadequate, but he had no better words for a situation he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted to understand. The girl seemed to consider whether to answer, and when she spoke, her English was heavily accented but comprehensible, suggesting she had learned from traders or missionaries at some point. What she said was so simple and so devastating that Jacob felt as if he had been physically struck. "My family is dead. All of them. I have nowhere to go. I don't want to live anymore." The brutal honesty of her statement, delivered without drama or manipulation, simply a statement of unbearable fact, resonated with feelings Jacob knew intimately. He had thought those same words countless times during the darkest period after his losses, had stood at the edge of his own emotional abyss, wondering whether continuing was worth the effort it required. Hearing them from this child, seeing his own despair reflected in her tear-stained face, somehow penetrated the numbness he had been using as protection against feeling anything at all. Jacob found himself asking questions he hadn't intended to ask. What had happened to her family? Where had she come from? How long had she been alone? Through her halting responses, he pieced together a story of tragedy that was all too common on the frontier. Her family's small band had been attacked by raiders. She wasn't sure if they were white men, Mexican bandits, or hostile members of another tribe who had killed the adults and scattered the children. She had fled during the chaos, had wandered for days without food or adequate water, and had finally collapsed here by this dwindling river, too exhausted and grief-stricken to continue. She told him her name was Casa, which she said meant dressed in furs, and that she was 12 summers old. She asked him directly if he was going to kill her or turn her over to soldiers, and her tone suggested she didn't particularly care which he chose. Death and capture both seemed preferable to continuing alone with her grief. The question forced Jacob to confront what he intended to do, now that he had involved himself by asking questions and listening to answers. Every practical consideration argued he should ride to the nearest settlement and report finding her. Let authorities handle the situation. through official channels that would keep him uninvolved and protected from complications. But Jacob found himself unable to ride away and leave her sitting by that dying river waiting to die herself. Something about her resignation, about the way she had given up on survival while still being alive, mirrored his own condition too closely. He heard himself speaking before he had fully decided what he was saying. "I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. You can come there, get some food and water, rest for a while until we figure out what to do." The offer was meant to be temporary, a brief humanitarian gesture before involving proper authorities. But even as Jacob spoke the words, he suspected he was committing to something more permanent than he was admitting to himself. Casa looked at him with surprise and obvious suspicion. She had no reason to trust any white man, and his offer probably seemed more likely to be a trap than genuine help. But her exhaustion and despair apparently outweighed her caution, because after a long moment, she nodded acceptance and stood shakily. Jacob helped her mount his horse, then walked alongside, leading the animal back toward his ranch, both of them silent during the journey, both processing what had just happened and what it might mean for their respective futures. The ranch house, when they reached it, looked as neglected as Jacob felt. The structure was sound but showed signs of deferred maintenance. The yard was unkempt, and the whole property had the atmosphere of a place that was being maintained for function, but not for any sense of home or comfort. Jacob helped Casa dismount, then led her inside to the kitchen, where he awkwardly prepared food and water, while she sat at his table, watching him with wary eyes. As she ate hungrily, clearly having been without adequate food for days, Jacob found himself studying her and seeing echoes of his own daughter in her age and vulnerability. Though Emma had been lighter-skinned and had died at 8 rather than surviving to 12. After Casa finished eating, Jacob showed her to the room that had been Emma's, which he had left essentially unchanged since her death, a shrine he visited rarely because the pain was too intense, but which he also couldn't bring himself to alter or repurpose. Casa looked around the room, at the small bed and the few toys and books that remained, and something in her expression suggested she understood whose room this had been and what its preservation meant. She turned to Jacob and spoke with unexpected perceptiveness for her age. "You lost someone, a child. You know how it feels." Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. Casa continued, her voice soft but clear. "Maybe that's why you didn't leave me by the river. Maybe we can help each other not die while we're still living." The statement was so accurate, so perfectly articulated what Jacob hadn't been able to admit even to himself, that he felt tears forming for the first time in years. This 12-year-old Apache girl, who had every reason to hate him and his kind, had somehow seen straight through his defenses to the core of his pain, and had offered something he hadn't known he needed. Recognition that his grief was real, that his struggle to find meaning in continued existence was legitimate, and that perhaps two broken people might survive better together than either could alone. That night, as Jacob lay in his own bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in his house, he thought about what he had done and what it would mean going forward. Taking in an Apache child would create complications with neighbors, with authorities, with everyone who believed strict boundaries needed to be maintained between settlers and native peoples. But for the first time in 5 years, Jacob felt something other than numbness or pain. He felt a flicker of purpose, a sense that maybe his continued existence could mean something beyond just not dying. Casa had said his help had changed what she believed was possible, but Jacob understood that her words and her presence had already changed something in him that he had thought permanently frozen. What she had said by that river, about not wanting to live, about having nowhere to go, had somehow given him permission to acknowledge his own darkness, and in acknowledging it, to begin considering whether light might still be possible. The first weeks of Casa's presence at the ranch were awkward and tentative, both of them feeling their way through an undefined relationship that fit no conventional category. Jacob made it clear she was free to leave whenever she wished, that he wasn't keeping her prisoner, that his offer of shelter came with no obligations beyond basic courtesy. Casa, for her part, made herself useful in ways that suggested she was trying to earn her continued welcome, helping with cooking, tending the vegetable garden that had gone wild during Jacob's years of neglect, even attempting to help with livestock chores, though her small size limited what she could manage. They developed a routine that worked around their mutual grief and their cultural differences. Mornings were spent on ranch work, with Jacob teaching Casa skills she would need if she was going to contribute meaningfully to the property's maintenance. She proved to be a quick learner, absorbing information about animal care, crop cultivation, and practical frontier survival, with the focused intensity of someone who understood that self-sufficiency was essential for survival. Jacob found himself enjoying the teaching role, rediscovering knowledge he had taken for granted, and finding satisfaction in watching Casa master new abilities. Evenings were quieter, usually spent with simple meals followed by time when Casa would practice reading from Emma's old books. She had learned basic literacy from missionaries but wanted to improve, while Jacob handled paperwork or performed small repairs on equipment. Sometimes they talked, conversations that started awkwardly but gradually became more natural as they learned each other's patterns and boundaries. Casa told Jacob about her life before the attack, about her family's traditions and beliefs, about the world she had lost. Jacob found himself reciprocating, sharing memories of Margaret and Emma that he had kept locked away for years, finding unexpected relief in speaking their names aloud and acknowledging the life they had shared before illness destroyed everything. About a month after Casa's arrival, Jacob's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Sullivan who lived 10 miles east, stopped by on his way to town and was shocked to discover an Apache girl living at Jacob's ranch. Sullivan's reaction mixed concern and disapproval, and he strongly suggested that Jacob needed to report her presence to authorities, that keeping her without official permission could bring legal troubles, and that frankly it was dangerous and inappropriate for a single man to be harboring a native child. Jacob listened to Sullivan's concerns with growing irritation, then responded with more force than he had intended that Casa was staying, that she was helping with the ranch in exchange for room and board, and that his arrangement was nobody else's business. After Sullivan departed, clearly unsatisfied but recognizing that Jacob wasn't going to be persuaded, Casa asked Jacob why he had defended her presence when it would have been easier to simply let Sullivan take her to authorities. Jacob struggled to articulate an answer, finally settling on simple truth. Because you belong here now. This is your home as much as it's mine, and nobody gets to tell us otherwise. The statement surprised both of them with its definitiveness, its implicit acknowledgement that what had started as temporary charity had transformed into something more permanent and more meaningful. The seasonal cycle continued, and as months passed, the ranch began showing signs of renewed vitality that reflected both Casa's contributions and Jacob's own awakening from the depression that had paralyzed him for years. The garden flourished under Casa's careful attention, producing vegetables they could eat and preserve. The house became cleaner and more organized, with small touches that made it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people actually lived. Most significantly, both Jacob and Casa seemed to be healing in ways neither had thought possible when they first met by that drying river. But healing was neither linear nor uncomplicated. Casa had nightmares that would wake her screaming, reliving the attack that had killed her family. Jacob would sit with her during those nights, offering presence without trying to force conversation, letting her process trauma in her own time and way. Similarly, Jacob had dark days when the weight of his losses felt unbearable, when he could barely function beyond basic necessities. Casa seemed to understand these cycles, would quietly take over more tasks on those days, would sit nearby doing her own work, while allowing him space to struggle without judgment or demand that he pretend to be fine. One particularly difficult evening, about 6 months after Casa's arrival, Jacob finally broke down completely. Grief overwhelming the control he usually maintained. Casa found him sobbing in Emma's room, and instead of withdrawing or becoming frightened by his emotion, she simply sat beside him and took his hand, offering silent companionship while he confronted pain he had been avoiding for years. When he finally could speak, Jacob told her about the guilt he carried, guilt that he had survived when his wife and daughter had died, guilt that he had been unable to protect them or save them, guilt that life was continuing when theirs had ended. Casa listened carefully, then spoke with wisdom that seemed impossible for her age. "My grandmother told me that the ones who die don't want us to die too. They want us to live and to remember them by living well. Your wife and daughter, my family, they don't want us to stop living. They want us to honor them by finding reasons to keep going." Her words were simple, but carried weight that Jacob felt in his chest, shifting something in how he understood his continued existence. Maybe survival wasn't betrayal. Maybe living well was actually the most meaningful way to honor those who could no longer live. The relationship between Jacob and Casa gradually evolved into something resembling family. Though neither used that word explicitly for a long time, they functioned as a unit, making decisions together about the ranch, sharing responsibilities according to their abilities, celebrating small successes, and supporting each other through continued struggles with grief and adjustment. Jacob found himself thinking of Casa, not as a temporary responsibility, but as someone permanent in his life, someone he would protect and provide for as long as necessary, or as long as she wanted to stay. Nearly a year after finding Casa by the river, Jacob made the relationship official through the legal means available in frontier territory. He filed for formal guardianship, claiming Casa as his ward, and taking responsibility for her care and upbringing. The process was complicated by frontier bureaucracy and by prejudices about natives that many officials held, but Jacob persisted with a determination that surprised him, refusing to accept rejection and finding lawyers who would argue that a stable home with someone committed to her welfare was better than any alternative the territory could offer. When the guardianship was finally approved and Jacob showed Casa the official papers, she stared at them for a long time before looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "This means I'm really your family now, not just someone who lives here." Jacob nodded, his own vision blurring slightly. "You've been family for a while now. This just makes it official so nobody can try to take you away." Casa's response was to hug him fiercely, the first truly affectionate gesture she had initiated since arriving at his ranch, and Jacob found himself hugging her back and realizing that somehow, impossibly, he had found a reason to care about the future again. The ranch continued operating, the seasons continued cycling, and Jacob and Casa continued healing together through shared work, shared grief, and shared determination to build something meaningful from the ruins of their respective losses. Jacob taught Casa everything he knew about ranching, about business, about navigating the frontier world she would need to survive in regardless of her Apache heritage. Casa, in turn, taught Jacob about her own cultural traditions, about seeing the land differently, about finding beauty and meaning in aspects of existence he had stopped noticing during his years of depression. They were not a conventional family by any measure, a middle-aged white rancher and a teenage Apache girl who had found each other by accident at the lowest points of their lives. But they were family nonetheless, bound not by blood but by shared trauma transformed into shared healing, by mutual recognition that survival was easier when faced together, and by the simple fact that neither had anyone else, and both had needed someone desperately. What Casa had said by that river, about not wanting to live, about having nowhere to go, had changed Jacob forever by reminding him that his own darkness was not unique, that others suffered similarly, and that sometimes helping someone else survive was the key to finding reasons to survive yourself. 3 years after Jacob found Casa by the river, the ranch had transformed from a neglected property maintained by a grief-stricken hermit into a thriving operation that served as testament to what two determined people could accomplish together. Casa, now 15, had grown into a confident young woman who could manage most ranch operations independently, and whose intelligence and work ethic impressed even the most skeptical neighbors who had initially questioned Jacob's decision to take her in. Jacob himself had emerged from the fog of depression that had defined his existence, rediscovering purpose and even occasional joy in daily life and in watching Casa flourish under his guardianship. But their success and their unconventional family structure continued attracting attention that was not always positive. Some neighbors admired what Jacob had done, saw Casa's transformation from traumatized orphan to capable rancher as evidence that compassion and hard work could transcend cultural boundaries. Others remained suspicious or hostile, viewing Casa's presence as dangerous precedent that blurred lines they believed should remain absolute, and periodically making comments or taking actions designed to remind both Jacob and Casa that they existed outside normal social acceptance. One significant challenge came when Casa reached the age where education became a legal requirement under territorial law. The nearest school was in town 15 miles away, and when Jacob attempted to enroll Casa, he encountered resistance from the school board, who argued that the institution was intended for white children, and that making exceptions would create problems with other parents. Jacob fought this decision with a ferocity that surprised him, hiring lawyers and making formal complaints, arguing that Casa was his legal ward and therefore entitled to the same educational opportunities as any other child under his guardianship. The battle took months and created divisions throughout the community, but Jacob ultimately prevailed through a combination of legal argument and simple persistence. Casa was admitted to the school, though her attendance there was marked by isolation and occasional cruelty from students who had absorbed their parents' prejudices. She endured these difficulties with remarkable resilience, focusing on learning rather than on social acceptance, and gradually earning grudging respect from teachers who recognized her intelligence and determination, even if they couldn't overcome their own biases about her background. During this period, Jacob also received contact from Apache tribal authorities who had heard about Casa's situation and wanted to verify that she was being treated well and was being given opportunity to maintain connection to her cultural heritage. Jacob welcomed these inquiries, understanding that they represented legitimate concern for a child's well-being, and he worked with tribal representatives to ensure Casa had access to elders who could teach her about traditions and language that he could not provide. These visits became regular occurrences, with tribal members occasionally stopping at the ranch to spend time with Casa, sharing stories and knowledge that connected her to her heritage while respecting the life she was building. With Jacob, Casa navigated between these two worlds with grace that Jacob found remarkable. She learned to speak, read, and write English with fluency that exceeded many of her classmates, but she also maintained and developed her Apache language skills and her understanding of cultural practices. She could discuss Shakespeare and algebra with her teachers, then switch to traditional stories and herbal medicine with visiting elders. Rather than being torn between two identities, she seemed to be creating a synthesis that honored both aspects of her background and her current life. As Casa approached adulthood, conversations began about her future and what she wanted to do with the education and opportunities Jacob had provided. She expressed interest in staying on the ranch, in eventually inheriting and operating it as her own property, but she also wanted to use her unique position to help bridge the divide between white and Apache communities. She talked about possibly serving as a translator and mediator, using her understanding of both cultures to facilitate communication and reduce conflicts that arose from misunderstanding and mistrust. Jacob supported these ambitions wholeheartedly, recognizing that Casa had the intelligence, character, and bicultural competence to make genuine contributions to improving relations between peoples who had been at odds for generations. He began teaching her not just ranch management, but also the business and legal knowledge she would need to navigate frontier commerce and property rights. He introduced her to his lawyer and to other professionals who could provide mentorship in areas beyond his own expertise. Most importantly, he made clear through both words and actions that he viewed her as his heir in every sense, that the ranch would be hers when he was gone, and that his greatest pride was watching her develop into someone who could forge her own path, rather than simply following patterns others had established. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in spectacular colors, Casa asked Jacob if he ever regretted finding her by that river, if taking her in had complicated his life in ways he sometimes wished he could undo. Jacob's response was immediate and emphatic. Finding her had saved his life as much as he had saved hers, had given him reason to keep living when he had been merely surviving, and had taught him that healing was possible even after losses that seemed to destroy any possibility of future happiness. He told Casa that the words she had spoken by that river, about not wanting to live, about having nowhere to go, had changed him forever by forcing him to confront his own parallel feelings and by showing him that helping someone else survive was itself a form of purpose worth pursuing. Their relationship had given both of them reasons to continue existing, had transformed two isolated individuals drowning in grief into a family that functioned through mutual support and shared determination to build something meaningful from tragedy. Casa responded that she often thought about that day by the river, about how close she had come to simply giving up completely, and about how Jacob's decision to stop and ask what was wrong had literally saved her life. She acknowledged that their relationship was unconventional, that many people would never understand or accept it, but that she had found in Jacob's guardianship something she had thought lost forever when her family was killed: a home, safety, and someone who valued her for who she was, rather than judging her based on superficial categories or prejudices. As years continued passing and Casa transitioned into adulthood, the ranch prospered under their joint management. Jacob gradually reduced his own active involvement, as age and old injuries made physical work more difficult, while Casa assumed increasing responsibility for day-to-day operations. She proved to be an excellent rancher, combining traditional frontier knowledge Jacob had taught her with innovations she learned from both Anglo and Apache sources. Her reputation spread, and she became known as someone who could manage property effectively while also serving as bridge between communities that rarely communicated constructively. Jacob lived to see Casa marry a young man from a neighboring ranch who had courted her patiently. Despite social complications, her Apache heritage created, and to meet his grandchildren, children of mixed heritage who would grow up navigating multiple cultural worlds just as their mother had. He took profound satisfaction in knowing that the family line he thought had ended with Emma's death had actually continued through Casa's adoption, that the ranch would remain in family hands for another generation, and that his legacy would include not just property, but also the evidence that compassion and courage could create family bonds as strong as any based on blood. In his final years, as Jacob's health declined and he became increasingly dependent on Casa's care, he often reflected on the chain of events that had begun by that drying river. He had been riding across his property expecting nothing but confirmation of drought and decay, and he had found instead a crying girl whose despair had mirrored his own. His decision to stop, to ask what was wrong, to offer help despite every practical reason to remain uninvolved, had changed both their lives completely and had created a family neither had thought possible after their respective losses. When Jacob died peacefully at 73, surrounded by Casa and her family, his last words were about that day by the river, about how lucky he had been to find someone who needed him as much as he had needed her, about how what she had said, those simple, devastating words about not wanting to live and having nowhere to go, had somehow given him permission to acknowledge his own darkness and, in acknowledging it, to begin finding light again. Casa held his hand as he died, weeping for the loss of the man who had saved her life and whom she had somehow saved in return, and she made sure he was buried beside Margaret and Emma, completing the family circle that had been broken but had somehow been repaired through unlikely means. In the years that followed, as Casa continued operating the ranch and raising her family, she often took her children to visit Jacob's grave and told them the story of how their grandfather had found her by a river, how she had been so lost in grief that she wanted to die, how he had stopped when he could have ridden past, how they had helped each other survive and heal. She explained that family could be built through choice as well as through birth, that compassion shown to strangers could create bonds stronger than many blood relationships, and that sometimes the most important moment in a life was when someone decided to stop and ask what's wrong, instead of looking away from another person's suffering. The ranch that had been Jacob's refuge and then had become their shared project eventually passed to Casa's children and grandchildren, carrying forward not just property, but also the values that had defined its transformation, that grief could be survived through connection, that cultural boundaries could be crossed through mutual respect and effort. That family meant people who chose to support and care for each other, regardless of their origins or backgrounds. The lonely rancher and the crying Apache girl had both thought their meaningful lives had ended when tragedy struck, but they had been wrong. Those lives had actually been preparing them to find each other and to build something neither could have created alone. Decades after Jacob's death, when Casa herself was elderly and was preparing to pass the ranch to the next generation, she was asked by a journalist documenting frontier history what she considered the most important moment of her life. Without hesitation, she described that day by the dying river when Jacob Thornton had stopped his horse, had approached a crying Apache child he had no obligation to help, and had asked what was wrong. What she had said in response, her raw admission of despair and loss, had changed him forever by revealing that his own suffering was not unique, and that helping others survive was itself a path toward healing. And his willingness to listen, to care, to offer shelter despite every practical reason to remain uninvolved, had saved her life and had given her the foundation to build a future she had thought impossible. Two broken people had found each other at their lowest moments, and through that finding had demonstrated that redemption was possible, that family could be chosen, and that sometimes the most profound transformations began with the simple question, "What's wrong?"